we've had a rich set of discussions, and we're thinking about these issues in three buckets. So we've talked about external controls and augmentation, but we're thinking the three buckets we want to explore in the panel are: what are the scientific opportunities and threats? What are the regulatory opportunities and threats? And then what are the reimbursement opportunities and threats? And so we have stakeholders from across our ecosystem here. I'm Dhruv Kazi. I'm an associate director at the Smith Center. I'm here with Dr. Christina Lalani.
I'm a postdoctoral research fellow also at the Smith Center and cardiology fellow at Beth Israel.
And we met three of the speakers, three of the panelists already. We're going to introduce the other two panelists.
So I'd like to introduce Dr. Rafael Cavalcante, who is an interventional cardiologist with a PhD in cardiovascular science from the University of São Paulo, Brazil, and a postdoctoral research fellowship from the Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He practiced cardiology for 12 years in Brazil before joining Boston Scientific. His current role is Vice President of Global Medical Affairs for the Interventional Cardiology Division, and he's responsible for clinical research and medical education in the coronary therapies and structural heart disease space. He's also chairman of the investigator-sponsored research committee for Boston Scientific.
And I'll introduce Dr. Laura Mauri. Dr. Laura Mauri is a senior vice president and chief scientific officer and medical officer at Medtronic. She's an interventional cardiologist. She spent a lot of time here, she pointed out, in this room, on both as an audience member and as a speaker. She was an interventional cardiologist at the Brigham for 15 years before she joined Medtronic. Currently leads the company's scientific, medical, research, and regulatory functions, and is a member of the executive committee. We're very happy to have you here and get your perspective on the questions we're talking about today. So we'll get started. Christina, you want to kick us off?
Yes, I will start with a question for Lorenzo. And of course, anyone from the panel is welcome to jump in. Lorenzo, you talked a little bit about the issues that come with external controls towards the end of your talk, this issue of confounding, but also several other biases that can occur, including the potential for informative censoring. As these methods and these approaches become extremely interesting from a regulatory perspective for primary evidence generation, how do you think that we make sure that the scientific rigor is maintained for these approaches?
So one approach could be to combine randomization and external data. Based on that, we can have rigorous control of false positive, false negative results. There are many settings in which doing randomized trial will become probably even more difficult than it is today, and we have seen a few throughout the talks. In those settings, actually, it might be that the scientific rigor of using data sets from various sources might have a scientific rigor that is superior than randomized clinical trial, because in cancer, I think randomized clinical trial are 99% of the time the gold standard, but there can be distortion mechanism in randomized clinical trial as well that in the end produce results which are not so useful for public health in general in other settings. So maybe there's not one answer for everything. I think I work mostly in cancer research, and I think methods like those that Issa mentioned, there's several researchers now working on highly robust statistical approaches, trying to get a bump in the efficiency and power, lowering sample sizes and still maintaining
the black magic part of it. Yeah.
Control of type 1 errors, and I think those will be the first that will be accepted by FDA for regulatory approval, and then once that trend will start, in my opinion, there will be more opportunities to discuss and probably to take a little more risk in the use of external data.
Thank you. Laura and Rafa, can I direct a practical, logistical question to you? From your perspectives, as the science moves along, there's the very practical consideration of whether the regulatory agencies are going to move along with the science. And so, let's say we figured out the methods. Are you, from your perspective, what are the concerns about getting the FDA to finally accept these methods, but not just the FDA, like other regulatory agencies around the world? What will it take to get them there to think about these methods?
You want to start? There's a lot in that question. I think I'd start, because you outlined scientific regulatory reimbursement. I guess I would start from the framework that regulators are looking for much the same kinds of questions that the scientists are or the physicians are who are involved in the research, which is and the statisticians in the room, the causal inference, right? That's what we're trying to understand. And ultimately, it's for the benefit of the patients who are going to require a treatment. So the fundamentals are the same. I guess what's different when I think about the regulator is that it's oftentimes a binary decision. Now, on the medical device side, because of the balance between pre-market data and post-market data, there's often a binary decision, and then there's the follow-up of information. And that's where, I think investigators and industry works in partnership with the FDA. And that partnership on the science is critically important. So I think on the medical device side, I think there's a very good understanding of the fact that we need data that's fit for purpose as a starting point, and that a combination of methods are needed. I think bringing regulators along is more about education of the entire ecosystem about exactly what's going on here, which is that randomized trial evidence can be really valuable in certain circumstances and depending on how trials are conducted. And at the same time, there's a huge opportunity to do more with observational data. I think it's a gap that we all recognize, that there's a huge amount of information that is underutilized. And so that's why a symposium like this is so important.
Thank you.
Yeah. So first, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to have me here. And this is a great question. I think in addition to what Dr. Mauri said, from our perspective, we see FDA in particular very interested in exploring any new innovative methodology in research that will increase efficiency. I think the regulators in the U.S. are fully aware of the burden that it is for society to develop evidence that will support the adoption of new technologies. And in addition to that, when these technologies are approved for an indication at first, and we do that a lot in device trials, we go after what is the easiest pathway for approval, and then physicians start to use that technology for other indications off-label. And the agency is fully aware that that creates risks for patients. So they have been, at least in our conversations, very open to any innovation in this space that would bring efficiency so that companies could then fund more trials that will answer the questions that we have.
If I could add, I just want to convey that this is not a new area. That it's been quite a long-standing area of collaboration with regulators, and that there already are many examples over the past 2 decades of using observational data, either standalone, using external data sources with external controls for approvals in the medical device space, for de novo approvals, or I think one of the questions that was brought up in one of the talks, I think, was, when do we take some risk? Because we do take risk, and sometimes it's appropriate because there will be a delay in getting something to a smaller population. Maybe it's pediatrics. Maybe it's understanding when a device is used in the real world setting differently than in the trial. Is it still safe? These are the kinds of questions that we have to take some statistical risk to answer, because we need to make determinations together with regulators. And those are the kinds of areas that it's not new. This has been going on for a long time, but we can do better to use data more comprehensively.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? And based on your experience, are there differences between U.S. and ex-U.S. regulators in the appetite for these methods? And similarly, is there a difference between pre-approval and post-approval studies in terms of appetite for these external data sources?
Yeah, I mean, it boils down to the fitness for purpose of the design and the data. But I would say, in simple terms, it's easier to look in the post-market setting at the use of external or observational data because you know more going into that. You have a prior that helps inform the questions that you might ask later. In the international versus non-U.S. versus U.S., I think it does vary depending on the geography. We're seeing across the world more and more variation across regulators and what their requirements are. The other trend that we see across the world is a desire in some geographies to see how do patients in a different country where there might be a different biology or a different practice setting, how could that modify the treatment effects? And perhaps the results of a global or primarily U.S. trial are not generalizable. They may be more open to, in a similar situation, augmenting randomized trial data with local observational data.
That makes sense. Thank you. Issa, we have a question for you. We talked about augmenting the available randomized data for the purpose of improving efficiency in estimating the average treatment effect. But this would also help possibly to estimate heterogeneous treatment effects, this improved efficiency. So can you give us a sense of, is the science ready to use these methods for HTE estimations, or are we getting ahead of our skis?
Thank you, Kazi. I think the methods are certainly more mature for the average treatment effect. The reason is it's a simpler object. It's the one that the interpretation of the trial is usually based on. We certainly have some things out in trying to use machine learning in an augmentation setting to identify subgroup treatment effects or an entire regression function conditional on covariates. The principles of the thing appear to be similar, and sometimes you can see big improvements because the trials are almost never designed to learn about subgroups. But I think the maturity of the work is certainly, and the volume of the work is certainly more on the average effects. In an exploratory setting, though, I think there is a lot of reason to pursue this analysis for subgroups or for regressions of the treatment effect on covariates.
Just to follow on both of those prior questions, I'm thinking about the regulatory question about what makes the FDA or CMS sort of ready to sort of adopt a new method. And, one thing that we've observed working pretty closely with the FDA is that it seems like they have an increasing sophistication and interest in learning new methods. I think that's one thing that's different than maybe it was even in the 10 years that I've interacted with them, starting with my interactions with Laura with the FDA, is that their thirst for learning new methods seems to be, at least currently, very high. As a result, that they seem very open-minded to learning. But there's one thing that keeps on coming up, and it goes to what the data that Lorenzo showed, which is what they demand consistently is some sort of understanding of what the ground truth is. So demonstration, right? So what Lorenzo, in your research, it seems like what you're doing is you're studying whether or not you can do randomized trial, a treatment effect, you have a ground truth, you're substituting out an external control group for the control group that you had in your trial. You're comparing whether or not those two answers were analogous, and that gives you some confidence that this approach might work. And they're demanding very similar things, when we've looked at whether or not administrative claims can substitute for clinical trial data outcomes. They want us to take a randomized trial that has both. We link those trial data to both claims, and we have the CEC adjudication outcomes, and we compare those outcomes together and say, well, look, we can recreate what we believe to be the ground truth. And so we're doing many of those analyses. People in this room have led them. And the challenge that I've found about that is that those are always exciting, and they, in some cases, have led to in a very specific field, changing what we feel and regulators feel, investigators feel, and industry feels comfortable with for assessing an outcome. But in some sense, if you've seen one validation study, you've seen one validation study.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the concern about it, is
Or
like
at least one endpoint, one set of endpoints.
Exactly. And they're, I don't know that we've done enough. One is that not sure that this type of work is so exciting for many of the, say, data vendors that are trying to put out their real world evidence data sets. We work with a few and we say, we're happy to do that validation study, and they don't seem particularly interested in doing that, yet they're generating big contracts with industry who are using their data. And the other is that I think every study itself is a bit limited in terms of its own generalizability. Every validation, and maybe it's just, when I'm curious what you say, Lorenzo, when you have a validation, how much that single validation generalizes to the next clinical trial or the next disease space or the next data set even. So that's on our minds, I think, more.
Bobby, maybe I'll ask you one more question before we open it up to the broader group for any questions. My question to you is, you talked a little bit about how real-world data is necessary as augmentation to trial evidence. Specifically, when we talk about external controls, do you think that this is a temporary scaffold that's necessary as we develop innovative trial design, or do you think that this is going to be a permanent part of the regulatory framework and something that is here to stay?
I think it's for sure here to stay. The question is I think the extent to which it sort of, it's as Laura mentioned, it's been a part of what we do. Is it going to be a growing part? Is it going to remain a fraction? Do we envision a world where actually we just conduct far fewer randomized trials? And, I don't necessarily see that world. I think that you'll see increasing use of hybrid sort of designs, probably, is my guess. I'm hopeful that there can be more kind of embedding of randomization within registries. Or electronic medical records, even electronic health records, even just, I just think that for one thing, why don't we move more toward randomized trials? I don't think that the cultural barriers, the policy barriers are really that surmountable. Many of the things that prevent us from having, much easier randomized trials are deeply embedded in, I think, our medical culture and even more broadly than that. Some of the things would require legislative action to change, and I don't think that we're anywhere close to thinking that that's a priority. I think most of our structures for collecting data on a routine basis in large data sets, like in whether Medicare or even in the state, there's state all-payer claims databases that are very similar to what is being collected in Sweden, but the people who run those, they're not interested in medical research per se, and we don't have a great structure for that. So I think that our ability to conduct randomized trials is going to continue to be limited for what I think is the foreseeable future. Now, I think certain components of randomized trials are going to get easier. I could foresee a world where clinical trial event adjudication goes away, or at least becomes much more limited based on large language models. Yeah. I think that's probably one thing that's going to become easier. I could see embedding a randomization just more seamlessly in our clinical care. So there's two movements. One is that can we make clinical trials easier to do more trials? And the other is, can we enhance our methods for observational studies, real-world data analysis to get better? Both are going to improve, and I don't know the exact proportion of the movement, but what I hope is that all the evidence will become stronger and there will be more easier ability to generate it.
Awesome, thank you. Questions from the audience? Sonia?
I had a question about how much of this do you see as a post-randomized trial flow, or having the trial results and say, let's find a data source, real-world data, to enhance or augment my results, versus doing it proactively, like having a disease-based registry that is collecting the data on purpose, already thinking about the trials that are coming down the line, or even better, coordinating with the same trialists, so that when you have the trials, you have the as good as possible data to make Issa happy. Like, what kind of data would make this more feasible in some settings where you can have ad hoc collection?
I can say that I think it should be intentional. And when we think about program for a therapy, Oftentimes we will have both the plan for a randomized trial as well as a collection of data in follow-up. And that could be a registry that's very highly controlled, or in our case, we have a platform type registry across all of our different products and disease states. So it's a bit like a national registry. And then in other cases, we collaborate with professional societies to collect all of the data on all procedures performed with a specific type of product going forward. So it's tailoring what are the questions that need to be answered either for regulatory purposes, but also reimbursement you mentioned. And reimbursement is actually one push towards randomized trials where there's a growing higher level of evidence required if there's anything that's pushing us one way. And then, quite honestly, one thing that we haven't talked about, but I think is probably in the background, is how do we evaluate the ongoing safety to learn more about products in the future? And that's a big component of the observational research that we do, and I think a big opportunity for improvement. When I think about how much more accessible data are going forward, we're solving some of the challenges that you mentioned in your introductory talk about identifying the exposure accurately, identifying the confounders accurately. The biggest barrier in the past has been, or the most costly thing has been labeling the outcomes accurately to be able to analyze them in observational data. I think all of these things are getting easier with better and more rich information, like you were referring to. But I think in any of these sources, even the studies that we lead, it's the censoring of data that I think you mentioned is one of the biggest challenges that we face, because the further we move away from randomized trials, the harder it is for us to be able to ensure that we have that information complete in follow-up. And it's not at random, obviously.
I mean, I want to reiterate in case you missed it, the standard for data around here is data that will make Issa happy. I had to reiterate what Sonia said. Actually, I want to pick up something that Sonia said in her talk and maybe direct this both to Issa and Dan, actually. The question is, if we collect data prospectively using a certain format, as the external data that is prospectively collected, well adjudicated, etc., are we then tying our future trials to the format of those data? By which I think Sonia used the term, do we have to match down the trials to the data set? And are you concerned about it? And maybe Dan, you can start on Issa.
So no, we are very concerned about that, but we're doing it the opposite way. We're prospectively designing the CRFs, and the plan would be to do that collaboratively with the sponsors, so that we cast a broader net than any one individual sponsor. So by doing that prospectively, I think that we totally obviate that problem.
But the goal is to reuse these data in the future, at which point future trials will be bound by the data structure that you have?
Not necessarily. I mean, our goal right now is there are specific targets. We know there are specific devices that are under development that are going to, as we understand it, want to enter the marketplace with cryogenic shock. So we know who they are, and our plan would be to work with them.
A priori. Okay. Issa.
So my mentor and close collaborator, Miguel Hernan, he has this framework of target trials, in case anybody hasn't heard it. And so one idea that we have been toying around with Lawson over there and Miguel and myself is that these external control things can be thought of as emulations of a new target trial, where you have this peculiarity that the data comes from two different places. That's different from conventional target trial emulation, where the data usually comes from one place, like a big claims database or EHR. Here, one part comes from the external observational data, possibly prospectively designed, but separately from the experimental arm. And so there is a interesting curiosity there that it's possible to conceive of a target trial that is more aligned with one or the other part of this two-part spectrum that I described. So you could pick a target trial that aligns very well with the registry, and then you may be a little incompatible with your experimental study, or you may say, by definition, my target trial is one where one arm would be the experimental one, in which case you better have good friends with Dan, be good friends with Dan, so his registry can be tailored to the trial you're running. So I think there's always going to be this triangulation, which is different from conventional observational studies, as well as conventional comparative trials.
Great, thank you.
I want to take it back to the question of payers. And Laura, you touched on this a little bit, but this is a question for both you and Rafa. This idea of reimbursement requirements being different than what is necessary for regulatory approval. We've seen this in the tricuspid space recently with requirements for active comparator arms in the post-approval setting. Do you think that external controls are going to start to play an increasing role? Do you think this is a shift where there's going to be a greater need for active comparators in the post-approval setting for reimbursement?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that when it comes to the post-approval space, I think we are already in a scenario where we're not making use of randomized data, and the regulators and the payers are very comfortable with the use of observational data, and in part thanks to the work that you do in validating how to measure the outcomes in these imperfect observational databases that are not necessarily following the patients for long term, but you're able to, using claims data, validate that you can actually measure outcomes through that. And I think that the discussion now with regulators is that can we use that framework to reduce the need for long-term follow-up, which is something that is impacting the cost of investing in clinical trials. So I think that for post-approval, I think it's a clear picture at this point.
I mean, I maybe take it in two parts because you have the U.S. and then you have outside the U.S. If you look at outside the U.S., it's been quite some time that many payer systems do require randomized trials. So that's, I'll maybe just put that to the side and talk about the United States versus unique setting. Maybe thinking about our FDA thinks about, they're not regulating the practice of medicine, but they're looking for the safety and effectiveness of devices and with a certain degree of certainty, right? On the side of payment, whether it's private payers or public payers, they're trying to understand the value that's created. And I think because of that difference, there's probably more fluidity in the FDA, at least on the medical device side, about what type of data are used as opposed to the comparative, more active comparator data that may be required on the payment side because of that need to demonstrate value. So I think what we see, the challenge that we see in innovation has been this gap between approval and reimbursement that is quite substantial in the United States.
Yeah. And increasingly on the pharma side, this is a similar phenomenon where the bar for getting regulatory approval is almost lower than the bar for payments, especially in ex-US markets.
Yeah.
Dan?
I just want to make another comment about the reimbursement part. This is unrelated to SHOP, but two comments. One is a lot of times they're quite related with guidelines, getting devices into guidelines, which is another big hurdle. So without devices being in guidelines, the reimbursement gets much more challenging. And in that regard, for example, I'm working on another heart failure device on SHOP. That's an implantable pulse generator, and we have been working with the Trippa database, which seems to have enough granularity to basically simulate a randomized trial. So we first did, in the heart failure space, we did a trial emulation of a study of ICDs, the Miracle trial, which was not the Miracle trial, but the CARE-HF trial, which was really one of the pivotal trials that got ICD usage in the United States. So we emulated that trial first with CRT, and then we applied it to this device that's approved but not really reimbursed. CMS accepted that as the post-approval study under an NCD, issued an NCD to allow that device now to be reimbursed for 6 years with this using Truveta, prospectively to emulate a clinical trial. I just think that overall, I think that the richness of these real-world data, these databases that are going to get easier and easier to access, I think that the regulators and the guidelines, which that may be the hardest, but also the CMS is going to become more receptive as the granularity of the data extractable from these massive databases are going to be available. I just think that the times, they have to shift with the times. I think it's unrealistic to think that it's going to be static.
Yeah. I'm going to briefly take us from the big picture down to some nerdy details. And so maybe this is directed at Issa and Lorenzo. If we have an external control that the design, a prospectively collected external control data set, and the idea is that it can be used for multiple trials, maybe even sequential trials. You use it as a control for study 1, and then you learn something and you use it again for study 2. Are we getting into statistical trouble when we start to look at the data multiple times and still use it as a control? I know what I was walking Issa into, but yeah.
I would say yes, but not a dramatic territory, in my opinion.
Not traumatic territory. Okay.
Not dramatic, yes.
Okay.
So something we considered a couple of years ago was controls sharing across multiple clinical trials. Simple concept like 3 clinical trials randomizing 1 to 3, and then all of them sharing across clinical trials the control data. So the results, obviously, it's a correlation between the estimate of the treatment effect. There's correlation also on the primary results, which is, yes, proceed to a phase 3 trial or not, or approve or not. Those are correlated, but in terms of controlling false positive, false negative, I think it can be still done in a rigorous way. There's still, of course, biostat work that we can do, improve the methods, but I don't see it as a major limitation reusing data. I mean, we reuse information all the time. I don't see why not for the development of new drugs.
Yeah. Issa?
So, the statistical stuff certainly will need some care here and there. I will say I have this fear that if you have a pool and it's reused, maybe the total effective available information for a given domain will be less. Mm-hmm. I don't know that this affects the properties within a study, but it's like a thing that we would all need to be mindful of, I guess. I do want to say, however, what the implications of what Lorenzo just said are for what we call pre-specification. And so consider a standard randomized trial. When we say pre-specification, we mean 2 things at the same time. Everything can be written down before doing it and before having knowledge of the data. And it happens temporally prior to the actual conduct of some part of the study and the analysis. This will no longer be the case if you're using data, at least for one of your arms. In particular, the first sense of pre-specification will be gone, because by looking at your prior analysis, because of the correlations Lorenzo was pointing out, you will have information about part of what you will estimate in the new data. It may not be entirely overlapping, but there will be strong correlation the bigger the past data that you're using is. And so I feel that will require a shift in thinking, because pre-specification is generally treated as a good and necessary thing. And it seems to me that one of its senses, and perhaps the one that I think is most important for inference, is to go away, at least in part, if you're using it.
Yes.
Can I add one thing strictly related to what Issa was mentioning? Something I'm more worried is cherry picking of external controls. That means there can be multiple initiatives that cover the same disease and try to answer similar questions. And the effect of trying to select what is the right, I mean, there can be some malicious intention or a mix. Sometimes we do cherry picking for the best purposes, but of course, I think just selecting the external control that give us the best treatment effect, just because we are always convinced that our drug is the best one, don't terribly bias the results. Even if you have 3 pretty good or pretty decent external control data that inflate the type 1 error quite a bit.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That's a great point. I think with that, in the interest of time, we're going to close the panel, and we just want to say thank you to all of our discussants, to all of our speakers, and we'll transition to some closing thoughts from Issa. Thank you, everyone.
For real.